Fundación UNAM cumple 30 años de sumar apoyos por las y los estudiantes de la máxima casa de estudios. Desde sus inicios en 1993, su propósito ha sido fortalecer ámbitos de la vida universitaria como la docencia, la investigación y la difusión cultural. Hoy cumplimos 30 años becando a jóvenes universitarios para que continúen su vida académica a través del mayor proyecto por la educación superior. Cumplimos 30 años alimentando su garra con apoyo nutricional para no abandonar sus estudios. 30 años de llevar tratamientos de salud comunitaria con el profesionalismo humanitario de los alumnos a zonas rurales. Pasamos 30 años otorgando becas de movilidad para que las y los estudiantes accedan a una educación sin fronteras. Además, en uno de los momentos más difíciles para la humanidad, protegimos a médicos residentes y enfermeros universitarios que luchaban en la primera línea de atención ante la COVID-19. Premiamos la investigación científica para promover el desarrollo del conocimiento universitario y abrimos espacios de reflexión para fomentar la divulgación de la ciencia, el arte, las humanidades, las sociales y muchas más. Gracias por formar parte de Fundación UNAM. Nada de esto sería posible sin tu apoyo, porque contigo hacemos posible lo imposible. Fundación UNAM cumple 30 años de sumar apoyos por las y los estudiantes de la máxima casa de estudios. Desde sus inicios en 1993, su propósito ha sido fortalecer ámbitos de la vida universitaria como la docencia, la investigación y la difusión cultural. Hoy cumplimos 30 años becando a jóvenes universitarios para que continúen su vida académica a través del mayor proyecto por la educación superior. Cumplimos 30 años alimentando su garra con apoyo nutricional para no abandonar sus estudios. 30 años de llevar tratamientos de salud comunitaria con el profesionalismo humanitario de los alumnos a zonas rurales. Pasamos 30 años otorgando becas de movilidad para que las y los estudiantes accedan a una educación sin fronteras. Además, en uno de los momentos más difíciles para la humanidad, protegimos a médicos residentes y enfermeros universitarios que luchaban en la primera línea de atención ante la COVID-19. Premiamos la investigación científica para promover el desarrollo del conocimiento universitario y abrimos espacios de reflexión para fomentar la divulgación de la ciencia, el arte, las humanidades, las sociales y muchas más. Gracias por formar parte de Fundación UNAM. Nada de esto sería posible sin tu apoyo, porque contigo hacemos posible lo imposible. Fundación UNAM y BBVA te invitan a participar en el Premio Educación Financiera Fundación UNAM BBVA 2022, tercera edición. Podrán participar las tesis de licenciatura, maestría y doctorado de la UNAM de forma individual o colectiva que aborden temas relacionados al impacto que genera la educación financiera en el plano emocional, en el aspecto ambiental, la correlación que existe en el cuidado del planeta y los hábitos del consumo responsable, la economía circular, inversiones verdes, el fenómeno de la economía del comportamiento, patrones generacionales que influyen desde el ámbito antropológico, las barreras de infraestructura, culturales, telecomunicaciones y tecnologías digitales de nuestro país. Se premiarán las mejores tesis conforme a lo siguiente. Primer lugar en tesis de licenciatura, 100,000 pesos. Segundo lugar, 70,000 pesos. Tercer lugar, 40,000 pesos. Primer lugar en tesis de maestría o especialidad, 200,000 pesos. Segundo lugar, 140,000 pesos. Tercer lugar, 70,000 pesos. Premios para tesis o tesinas de doctorado, 250,000 pesos. Tienes hasta el 24 de febrero del 2023 para inscribir tu trabajo. Consulta las bases en www.fundacionunam.org.mx y participa con nosotros. Fundación UNAM cumple 30 años de sumar apoyos por las y los estudiantes de la máxima casa de estudios. Desde sus inicios en 1993, su propósito ha sido fortalecer ámbitos de la vida universitaria como la docencia, la investigación y la difusión cultural. Hoy cumplimos 30 años becando a jóvenes universitarios para que continúen su vida académica a través del mayor proyecto por la educación superior. Cumplimos 30 años alimentando su garra con apoyo nutricional para no abandonar sus estudios. 30 años de llevar tratamientos de salud comunitaria con el profesionalismo humanitario de los alumnos a zonas rurales. Pasamos 30 años otorgando becas de movilidad para que las y los estudiantes accedan a una educación sin fronteras. Además, en uno de los momentos más difíciles para la humanidad, protegimos a médicos residentes y enfermeros universitarios que luchaban en la primera línea de atención ante la COVID-19. Premiamos la investigación científica para promover el desarrollo del conocimiento universitario y abrimos espacios de reflexión para fomentar la divulgación de la ciencia, el arte, las humanidades, las sociales y muchas más. Gracias por formar parte de Fundación UNAM. Nada de esto sería posible sin tu apoyo, porque contigo hacemos posible lo imposible. Fundación UNAM y BBVA te invitan a participar en el Premio Educación Financiera Fundación UNAM BBVA 2022, tercera edición. Podrán participar las tesis de licenciatura, maestría y doctorado de la UNAM de forma individual o colectiva que aborden temas relacionados al impacto que genera la educación financiera en el plano emocional, en el aspecto ambiental, la correlación que existe en el cuidado del planeta y los hábitos del consumo responsable, la economía circular, inversiones verdes, el fenómeno de la economía del comportamiento, patrones generacionales que influyen desde el ámbito antropológico, las barreras de infraestructura, culturales, telecomunicaciones y tecnologías digitales de nuestro país. Se premiarán las mejores tesis conforme a lo siguiente. Primer lugar en tesis de licenciatura, 100,000 pesos. Segundo lugar, 70,000 pesos. Tercer lugar, 40,000 pesos. Primer lugar en tesis de maestría o especialidad, 200,000 pesos. Segundo lugar, 140,000 pesos. Tercer lugar, 70,000 pesos. Premios para tesis o tesinas de doctorado, 250,000 pesos. Tienes hasta el 24 de febrero del 2023 para inscribir tu trabajo. Consulta las bases en www.fundacionunam.org.mx y participa.
Bienvenidos al ciclo de conferencias Universidades por la Ciencia, organizada por Fundación UNAM, el Colegio Nacional y el conjunto de universidades y centros de investigación del Consorcio Universidades por la Ciencia. Les agradecemos el interés y que nos acompañen. Muy bienvenidos todos. Y el día de hoy tenemos una conferencia muy especial a cargo del profesor Christopher Scotese de la Universidad de Northwestern en Illinois, en Estados Unidos, y quien es también profesor emérito en la Universidad de Texas. El tema es sobre las temperaturas durante el Fanerozoico, la era del Fanerozoico, los últimos 540 millones de años, y cómo ha ido cambiando y es lo que controla el clima en la Tierra. La distribución de océanos y continentes, yo creo que es una de las características más importantes en la evolución de nuestro planeta, y estas a lo largo de los años pues han ido cambiando. Ha habido épocas en donde tenemos todos los masas continentales en un solo supercontinente y con ello también un superocéano. Y el profesor Scotese es un especialista y es el presidente del proyecto de Paleomap. Welcome to the Universities for Science Seminar Cycle, organized by the UNAM Foundation, Colegio Nacional, and a group of universities and research centers in the US, United Kingdom, Spain, Brazil, Argentina, Chile. Thanks very much for joining us. And today we have a very special conference by Professor Christopher Scotese from Northwestern University, Illinois, and who is also Emeritus Professor of the University of Texas. Professor Scotese is also the president of the Paleomap project. It's one of the largest projects we have in the geosciences. So thanks very much, Chris, for accepting this invitation. We are extremely interested and happy in your studies. And in the evolution of our planet, the tectonic evolution of our planet, a major characteristic is the distribution of oceans and continents. This is also linked to the climate system and also to the life in the planet. We depend on this special characteristic of the Earth having a liquid water, the oceans on this surface. And this distribution, the paleogeography, has been changing continuously over the time. And Professor Scotese will today present us the studies, his research on the Phanerozoic paleotemperatures in the last 540 million years. Thanks all of you for joining us. And please, any questions, comments, you can do it through our platforms. En el panel nos acompañan el presidente de Fundación UNAM, el licenciado Dionisio Meade, la directora ejecutiva de Fundación UNAM, licenciada Araxi Rodríguez, la presidenta del Consorcio Universidades por la Ciencia, Araxi Urrutia, y nuestro invitado, el profesor Christopher Scotese. We are joined by the president of the UNAM Foundation, Dionisio Meade, the executive director of the UNAM Foundation, Araxi Rodríguez, and the president of the Consortium of Universities for Science, Araxi Urrutia, and our special guest. Finally, just would like to mention that this seminar cycle is part of the International Year of Basic Sciences for Sustainable Development by the United Nations and the UNESCO. Thanks all, and Profesor Meade, por favor, unas palabras.
Sí. Muchas gracias, Jaime. Muchas gracias por tu presentación. Muchas gracias al profesor Scotese por la presentación que nos habrá de hacer el día de hoy. Y muchas gracias a todos quienes nos acompañan en la audiencia. Sentimos una gran satisfacción por lo que mencionaba Jaime al final de su presentación. Él decía que estamos celebrando el Año Internacional de las Ciencias Básicas para el Desarrollo Sustentable. Y nosotros nos hemos venido sumando ese esfuerzo Y para nosotros es un gran motivo de orgullo y de satisfacción que el comité de la UNESCO, el comité asesor de la UNESCO, nos haya invitado para formar parte de este comité, porque significa el reconocimiento de que estos esfuerzos, ahora comentábamos con Jaime Urrutia, que son más de 100 las presentaciones que hemos hecho de estos consorcios en nuestras pláticas semanales, y que son ya también más de 100 documentales por la ciencia, los que hemos presentado en nuestras sesiones de los jueves. Es muy interesante lo que hoy nos habrá de comentar el profesor Scotese, y él va a hablar de 540 millones de años. El hombre tiene muchos menos años de presencia en el planeta, y sin embargo el daño que le ha causado en materia climática pues hace que nos estemos preocupando no de los próximos millones de años, sino de los próximos lustros. Inclusive en el caso de México, ahora que se ha anticipado el calor, se genera una preocupación por si este cambio está significando que floreen antes las plantas, que los pájaros se sientan un poco confundidos con el antecedente del calor, pues esté siendo una respuesta adecuada al cambio en la temperatura en el caso de México y en el caso en general del planeta. Yo creo que las reflexiones que nos hará el profesor Scotese pues nos llevan otra vez a meditar en la urgencia de pensar en el cuidado del planeta. Nosotros hemos subrayado que la reciente pandemia trajo consigo una revaloración del cuidado del planeta, y que eso se ha vuelto mucho más necesario en el proyecto de vida de la gente en la Tierra. Y nos interesa mucho que estas presentaciones participen los jóvenes, y que los jóvenes escuchen y se sientan motivados a hacer de su vida profesional, de sus maestrías o de sus doctorados, una opción alrededor de los temas que ahora nos van a presentar. Como hemos comentado en ocasiones, nada sería más grato para el profesor Scotese y para nosotros también que en algunas de las presentaciones posteriores, en donde en alguna ocasión hemos tenido la presencia de un premio Nobel, pues sean estos jóvenes los que se acompañen al profesor Scotese en sus presentaciones y nos comportan ya después de haber realizado su trayectoria profesional o sus maestrías o doctorados, compartiendo los conocimientos y los espacios de investigación que derivan de estas presentaciones. Muchas gracias a todos, agradecemos su presencia y pues con el mayor interés de escuchar lo que ha pasado en el clima de la Tierra en estos últimos 540 millones de años, pero también escuchar al profesor Scotese de lo que podría pasar en los próximos muy recientes años que habremos de enfrentar y en los cuales el cambio climático forma ya sin duda una agenda esencial en el cuidado del planeta. Muchas gracias a todos y muy buenas tardes.
Thanks very much. And Chris, yeah, we're happy to listen to you. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you for, thanks to the UNAM Foundation for the invitation to discuss and present my research on global climate and CO2 levels, and particular to Professor Urrutia for hosting this presentation. My talk will last about 15 minutes and there'll be time for questions at the end. And I'm happy to stay a little bit longer for more in-depth discussions and questions if there are any. The work that I'll be presenting today has been mostly published. This is the title page from one of the publications entitled Fanerozoic Paleotemperatures, the Earth's Changing Climate During the Last 540 Million Years. I'd like to thank my co-authors, Haijun Song, Ben Mills, and Dow Vandermeer for their contributions to the paper. I will also be presenting an abstract that I published at AGU and on CO2 levels during the last 540 million years, though the primary emphasis will be on temperature. This is the results of my study, which is a temperature curve. You can see the time scale along the bottom that extends from the modern world back to the Cambrian. And the vertical axis is the global average temperature. And the first thing to notice is that the temperature has changed multiple times during the past, increasing and decreasing. There have been times of relative warmth, such as the Cretaceous, and other times when the Earth has been much colder during the Permian and Carboniferous. Interspersed between these warm intervals and cold intervals have been unusual spikes and rapid increases in temperature. One of these, the most prominent, is the Permo-Triassic thermal maximum. Another one is the Cenomanian-Turonian thermal maximum. And in addition, there have been a few rapid decreases in temperature. One of the most notable is the Cretaceous Tertiary impact winter, basically the impact of the Chicxulub meteorite that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. So though I won't have time to go through each of these individual events, in this talk, I'll try to give you an idea of how this curve was produced, the data that was used, and some of the major interpretations that we can make once we understand how the Earth's climate has changed through time. The Earth's climate has been of interest to me because I'm basically an Earth historian. Most of my research during the past 40 years has focused on the history of the Earth, both the plate tectonic evolution of the planet, the paleogeographic evolution, mountains, shallow seas, deep seas. And from my point of view, it was very important to complement the paleogeographic and plate tectonic evolution with a study that described how the Earth's temperature has changed. Temperature and paleoclimate is one of the great themes of Earth history, along with paleoceanography and paleobiogeography. And all together, these themes are something I'm writing up in a book entitled The Evolution of the Earth System, which I hope to have finished in several years. So this is one of the main themes of the book, how the Earth's temperature has changed through time. You can see along this middle axis, there are black and white swaths. These represent, in general, whether the Earth was in a cool period, indicated by the black shading, or a warm period. And I've begun to identify specific warming and cooling intervals back through time. Now, this work is something I've been doing for many years, and I put up this graphic to show the progress in the research and how much more we know now in 2021 as opposed to 1998 when I made this first diagram. But you can see the themes are basically the same. We have periods of warm and cool. We know much better now what the intervals, the details of the intervals, and there are interesting events along this curve. Some of the major features, again, are a cool Precambrian, a very cold event in the late Ordovician, Permo-Carboniferous cool event, hothouse times during the early Mesozoic and late Mesozoic and early Cretaceous, and then in the last 60 million years, the Earth's climate has gradually cooled as the Earth has gone into an icehouse condition. The one thing I've done since the publication of both these papers is I've tried to elaborate on the late Precambrian temperature events in terms of the very famous snowball Earth. And without saying too much about this, we know that there were three major intervals which the Earth became very cold, and in case of the Sturtian Ice Age, the entire Earth froze as a solid ball of ice. This graph, like the previous graph, shows how the temperature changed through the late Precambrian, and that's one way to look at temperature change or paleoclimate. In other words, trying to get a time series of how the average global temperature changed. The other way to look at it is to make a snapshot for a particular interval. These curves represent the latitudinal temperature gradient along the surface of the Earth. If you look closely, you can see some small black plus signs near this green line. These are the temperature measurements from the North Pole, from the South Pole to the equator to the North Pole on the present day world. So this represents the latitudinal temperature gradient. The number at the end is the average temperature that is represented by this curve. So right now the Earth's temperature is between 14 and 15 degrees. As we see, the temperature has increased in time and also has decreased. the temperature increases in two interesting ways. One is if we look at the temperature at the equator, modern temperatures are about 26 degrees centigrade, and the temperatures at the equator can obviously increase, and we can increase to a maximum of about 40 degrees. 40 degrees is a maximum because that's the lethal limit. Above 40 degrees, basically things begin to be wiped out and we have major extinction events. If you think about it, if your child has a temperature of 40 degrees, you rush them to the hospital and try to take important interventions to reduce the temperature. Also, the temperature at the equator can fall, and I plotted as this dashed gray line the temperatures that we think existed during the snowball Earth time. What's remarkable is at the equator, the average temperature was about -10 degrees centigrade. That's the temperature you require to freeze the entire surface of the Earth. Anything warmer than that, there's a little bit of water, free water at the surface. The temperature obviously decreases as you go towards the poles. In fact, it's so extreme that I had to plot it through the text. So the snowball Earth temperatures at the poles were something like -90 degrees. Whereas today's temperatures are about -20 degrees. The statistics for each of these curves is given in this table. We can see that today's world, 15 degrees average temperature, 26 degrees at the equator, polar temperatures about -20 degrees. The ice cap, which characterizes icehouse worlds, extends to about 68 degrees on average, north and south. And the deep ocean temperatures are about 4 degrees. At the extremes, this dashed line at the top represents the Permo-Triassic thermal maximum, or the great event that caused a great extinction on the Earth, when temperature approached the lethal limit. The global average temperature was 34 degrees. In other words, more than double present day temperatures. Tropical temperatures approached 40 degrees. It was so warm at the poles that obviously there was no ice cap, and the deep oceans were much warmer than they are today. So what I've done is indicated each of the important time intervals from the earlier curve and connected them with the appropriate paleolatitude, the polar equator gradient. Anyway, this is another way of looking at how the Earth's temperature has changed. The temperature has cooled, and also the thermal gradient has steepened, as the Earth warms, it's flattened. You can see how the gradient is much flatter during hothouse times. Okay. This diagram combines both the time series temperatures with the pole to equator gradients. And the way to read this curve is the black line is the average temperature, and the given by this color scale here. And then the what we see is the bluer colors, the colder colors at the poles. These are the times when we had polar ice caps, when the blue areas extend. The very hot areas are given by the reds and the darker browns. And we can see the Permo-Triassic extinction. And again, what we see is the Earth's temperature has alternated between hothouse times and cooler times. And I think we've identified most of these intervals. There are about 50 altogether through the Fanerozoic. The dashed line that runs through the curve is an average temperature during the Fanerozoic. We can compare this diagram with a similar diagram produced using global climate models. And the coloring is very similar. There's some differences. Global climate models tend to run hotter near the equator and cooler at the poles. And the ups and downs are similar but not identical, because global climate models require CO2 to model the changing temperature. And the thin black line is the variations in CO2 published in Foster et al. 2017. And you can see that the climate model basically mirrors the CO2 curve. So I'm also interested in CO2 because if we want the climate models to work proper, we have to give them the appropriate values for CO2. So going back to the paper, let me just step through the basic logic, which is fairly simple. Starting out what we knew during the last 30 years, this is from a paper by Alfred Fisher in 1981 and 82, where he identified this double hump pattern of temperature, where there is ice house periods separating greenhouse periods back through the Fanerozooic, very simple pattern. And this was responsible for a variety of biotic crises, and also is reflected in sea level. Warmer times, sea level is higher. Colder times, ice caps grow and sea level is lower. No great surprises. During the last 5 years, a number of studies have been published, which I list here. And you can see there's a great similarity in the shapes of the curves, even some of the individual peaks. There's some disagreement regarding the heights of the peaks. For the Cenozoic and Mesozoic, in late Paleozoic, there's generally good agreement. But one area which is still a frontier is what is happening in the early Paleozoic. Some of these curves suggest that global temperatures exceeded 40 degrees in the early Paleozoic, whereas my curve, which is shown in black, has temperatures in the early Paleozoic which are comparable to the rest of the Paleozoic, the rest of the Fanerozooic, excuse me. This is the most recent curve published by Shaviv and Weiser. It's interesting, I think it's a beautiful representation. Their curve is in black. The curve that we came up with is the orange dots. And there's a very good agreement simply because we're using their data. Our data, the data that we use primarily to define these peaks and troughs is oxygen isotope data, and which is compiled by Jan Weiser and colleagues, also Ethan Grossman. This curve also plots the increasing insolation due to the fact the sun has been getting brighter through time. This red line is just a CO2 curve for comparison. What NIR has added, which is unique, is this curve in blue, which is an estimate of how temperature may have been modulated by the rotation of the solar system through the galactic axes. In other words, there's a lot of dust in the galactic plane. So when the solar system passes through the galactic plane, the temperatures on Earth cool, and when it's above the galactic plane, temperatures are warmer. And this cycle is about 150 million years. He combined both the isotope and the galactic measurements to come up with this green curve. And I guess the main point is that the galactic pattern seems to match some of the long wave frequencies that we see in the global temperature curve, though it's still unsettled science. So what are the data that are used? There are basically two data sets that are used to come up with this curve. One is geological data, and the other is oxygen isotope data. The geological data is the sort of data that every geologist is familiar with. Basically coals, evaporites, tillites, things that tell geologists what the climate is like. Using these data, we've mapped what are called Köppen climatic belts. The Earth can be divided into 5 major climatic belts, A, B, C, D, E, which range from the polar cold climates to tropical warm climates. And you can see the temperature, the average temperature for each of these belts indicated. So again, the equatorial temperatures are about 26 degrees. At the poles, it's about -20 at the North Pole, -30 at the South Pole. And there's a gradient, warmer at the equator and cooler at the poles. So the trick is, from a geological point of view, if we want to understand past climate, is to map these Köppen belts on past global reconstructions. So the first thing we have to do is put the continents in their ancient position. Then we have to plot the geological indicators of climate, and I've summarized them here in this legend. Warm and wet, cool and wet, dry, cold, so that we can identify the tropical wet belt, the subtropical arid dry belt, characterized by evaporites, the warm temperate belt where it's wet enough, you get colds again, like you do at the equator. And then at the cooler temperatures, during specific time intervals, you get ice and snow. And sometimes ice and snow forms large ice caps, which extend into the tropical belts. So this is the time period 280 million years ago, which is pretty much like today's world with 5 well-defined climate Keppen belts. For the Cretaceous 100 million years ago, we can identify some of these belts, but you'll notice that the cold belts are missing. That's because we're in a hothouse world and there was no permanent ice caps at this time. However, we still have our tropical belt, our subarid belt, and the warm temperate belt is much expanded in both hemispheres. So one calculation that we do, which is very simple-minded, is we take the average temperature of each of these belts, determine the area of each of these belts in the past, and use that to calculate an average global temperature. And this is the curve that we get. So this is the long-term temperature based on how the Keppen belts have expanded and contracted back through time. So modern temperature, about 14 degrees centigrade. During hothouse times, the temperature is 20 to 22 degrees on average, or 8 degrees warmer. During icehouse times, we drop back to something like 14 degrees. And so you can see the same double hump pattern of ice age, hothouse, or icehouse, hothouse, icehouse, hothouse, and icehouse. But this isn't very detailed, and that's because the geological data is not very detailed. All we can do is map very broad belts. It does, however, allow us to begin to generate pole to equator temperature curves, as I discussed earlier. The dotted line is the modern pole to equator temperature gradient, and the gradient has changed as the Earth has warmed and cooled. To get a more precise estimate of when it's hot and when it's cold and how hot and cold it is, we use oxygen isotope data. And this was data compiled by my colleague Haijun Song from the compilations of Weiser and Grossman. You can see all the individual measurements. There's quite a bit of variability. The red curve is the average. The pink curve represents a 94% confidence interval. And each of the colors represent different sources of oxygen isotope data. And each of these has their problems. So the question is, how do we get temperature from oxygen isotope data? We convert the ratio of the oxygen isotopes into temperature. There are a variety of schemes to do this. And we're not always sure if we've eliminated diagenetic effects or biological effects. But the pattern is fairly robust. And again, we see during the early Paleozoic an indication oxygen isotope temperatures. One of the interpretations is that temperatures were very warm. Another interpretation is that the basic composition, oxygen isotopic composition of the ocean has changed through time. So if it's changed, maybe this represents higher oxygen isotope ratios, oxygen 16 ratios in the past. So this is important data. What we did in the paper was simplify it. So we took each of these data sets and calculated an average value at each 1 million year interval. And so the black dots are the same data, but averaged at 1 million year intervals. And then I used a very simple or straightforward curve fitting technique, which basically tries to go through the data points. Rather than smoothing through the data, it said, well, we're going to assume that these data points are real and try to construct a curve that represents the variation along the curve. The dashed line is a running average of about 60 million years. And you can see it mimics what we got from the geological data. The bottom curve, however, I think is what is the important information we can derive from the oxygen isotope data. In other words, it's not so important what the absolute values of temperature are. What's important is how the temperature has deviated or changed through time. So what I was interested in is the delta tropical temperature. In other words, taking the individual temperature measurements and subtracting the running average to get a better idea if temperature is increasing or decreasing. And that's what the curve B represents. It's the same shapes, but that flattened based on the running average. And so these are the individual climatic events. Just so you know, the black dots are where we have data, and the open areas are where there aren't any data. So you can see there is definitely some gaps in the record that need to be filled. This is just a replot of the delta tropical temperature curve. And because the data is sometimes incomplete and sometimes contradictory, I made some modifications to the curve based on geological and paleontological constraints. For instance, we know there was a major ice age at the end of the Ordovician. So basically I included this sort of spike. So basically anything that's colored is my modification of the basic oxygen isotope curve as a result of constraints we get from paleontology or geology. In some cases, we just have a higher resolution record from the deep ocean compared to the shallow ocean. Here you can see the KT impact winter. And we know when that occurred, so we can show that in greater resolution. This is just a quick look at the gray curve is the oxygen isotope curve from surface waters. This curve is the deep sea temperatures, which people like Scotese and Westerfield have used to create a very detailed temperature curve for the Cenozoic. So basically, I use the deep sea temperatures to improve our resolution of the shallow temperature by basically fitting and superimposing what we know about the deep sea on the shallow sea portion. So in other words, I modified the oxygen isotope data in ways that I thought were reasonable and came up with this curve, this composite curve. The first curve, the dashed line, is the data, is the test temperature estimates from the purely geological data, the lithological indicators of climate. And then I superimposed on that curve the delta tropical temperature changes from the oxygen isotope data. So that's how the curve was made. So now let's look at various aspects of the curve. Some interesting questions that one can ask is how do these temperature changes relate to geological events? So I thought two geological events which would be interesting to compare to the temperature curve were volcanic eruptions, in particular large igneous provinces, and impacts. The large igneous provinces are indicated by the black squares. The size of the square is roughly the estimate of the eruption intensity, or in other words, how many millions of square kilometers per millions of years. And by far, the largest event is the Siberian traps, which took place during the Permo-Triassic boundary, though there have been some other large events through time. The circles are impacts. Obviously, you'll recognize the Chicxulub impact, the largest impact of the Fanerozoic. And along this axis is the diameter of the various impact craters. So there's a few big ones. There's one big one, a few medium-sized ones, and a fair number of small impact craters. If we now plot the impact craters and the ellipse along the temperature axes, we can see some interesting, I think, reasonable correlations. The temperature peak of the Permo-Triassic correlates with the Siberian traps. Some of the dips in temperature correspond to impacts, such as the Chicxulub impact was responsible for the impact winter at the KT boundary. And there are a few other correlations which were kind of a surprise. And again, I want to emphasize, none of this data, none of this geological data was used to produce this curve. So what we're looking at is just a raw correlation between the ellipse and the impact events. You can see a few shaded circles, and these are sort of my guesses that, well, if these decreases in temperature correspond to impacts, maybe we should be looking for impact events at other changes, decreases in temperature, but it's just purely speculative. One of the largest speculations, or one of the most imaginative, is the reason for this end of Ordovician ice age. Very interesting, it was a very brief event that occurred during a period which was generally warm, in other words, a hothouse. And but there's no, well, that's actually not true anymore. And the question is, where is the crater for this event? I named this event the Keone event. Chione is the goddess of snow. She was a daughter of Borealis, who was the Greek god of winter. They've recently found something that might be an impact crater in Western Australia that is the right age. However, it's very small, relatively speaking, not anywhere near as large as the Chicxulub impact. Another thing we can correlate with the temperature model, and this is a little bit circular, is the ice ages, in particular the amount of glacial deposits and the area of millions of square kilometers of ice caps. And what's interesting to note here is this dashed line, which appeared on the temperature graphs. Basically, at 18 degrees centigrade, if the average temperature of the Earth is above 18 degrees centigrade, there cannot be a polar ice cap. The Earth is just too warm for ice and snow to remain permanently frozen at the poles. So to have ice age, you basically have to have temperatures cooler than 18 degrees. This is just a look at related temperature variations. The black line is the global average temperature. The red line is the temperatures at the equator, which of course would be warmer. And the dark blue line is the deep sea temperatures, and then the light blue line is the estimated temperatures at the poles. So now we can look at a little more detail at some of the temperature events through time. We've touched on these already. The Paleozoic temperatures, basically we have three hothouse time intervals: early Paleozoic, Devonian essentially, and then Permo-Triassic, that are separated by major icehouse intervals. Each of these abbreviations are basically the names corresponding to the numbers of the cooling or warming event, which I call chronotemps. And some of these some of these span large time intervals, and sometimes within a large time interval, like the Permo-Carboniferous Ice Age, there are rapid variations, which we think are due to orbital changes, Milankovitch orbital changes, which modulate the amount of energy from the sun. These patterns show up in rock units called cyclothems, which geologists have been mapping. There's about 30 of them during this time interval. And they're similar in many respects to the Milankovitch variations that we see during the last glacial maximum, during the last million or 1.5 million years, during the Quaternary Ice Age. Global temperature during the Mesozoic was mostly above this dashed line, so there were no ice caps, though it got fairly cool in the late Jurassic, early Cretaceous, cool enough so that we had winter snow and ice forming at the poles, and we have evidence of glaciers and some ice deposits, but it's not clear that they formed significant ice caps, or that they probably survived through the winter but did not form significant ice caps. During the Cretaceous, things warmed up quite a bit. We have the Cenomanian, Turonian thermal maximum, and things were cooling off during the late Cretaceous, and then basically, when the Chicxulub asteroid hit, basically the Earth was put into an impact winter, and then temperatures warmed up during the Paleocene. During the Cenozoic, starting at the KT extinction, temperatures warmed up during the Paleocene, Eocene ice hothouse. We have our early Eocene thermal maximum. Probably one of the most well-known temperature spikes is the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum. There was also a middle Eocene thermal maximum, and then things rapidly cooled off during the late Eocene and early Oligocene as the Earth entered its current icehouse conditions. Though temperatures varied up and down, temperatures were mostly below the 18 degrees centigrade boundary, so there was an ice cap at the South Pole. Maybe during the middle Miocene thermal maximum, most of it melted. And then during the last 2 million years, the Earth has gotten much cooler, so that now we're in the same cycle of glacial and interglacial events caused by the Milankovitch. Now, at the end of the talk, I'll be talking a little bit about man-made global warming and the increases in CO2. And what you can see here is hard to see, but basically temperatures are now skyrocketing up. And this is my estimate of where we're going to end up in about 200 or 300 years. This is the post-anthropic warming, and temperatures may get as high as about 19 or 19.5 degrees. So this is a projection of temperatures. What you can see in color is the IPCC temperature estimates, and they have various estimates based on the amount of CO2 emissions. Here we are today. This is the temperature increase that we've seen. The black line is my estimate of temperature increase based on a fairly simple carbon model. What I was interested in seeing is how the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere will change based on global population, fossil fuel use by people, the combination of fossil fuels and renewables, and I came up with this prediction, which is somewhere between the high emissions and very high emissions predictions. Temperatures maximize about 19.5 degrees, and then begin to fall due both to population decreases and the fact that we are using fewer fossil fuels. So if we take this 19.5 degree prediction, we can plot it on the temperature curve, just to get a geological perspective. So in the future, the temperature will be somewhere between 16.5 to 19.5 degrees is a reasonable range of temperatures based both on the IPCC estimates and my own estimates. And so we can see at what times in the geological past, the Earth was also within this temperature range. Again, what's interesting is this transition spans the 18-degree global temperature average, which means below this, we can still have some ice at the poles. Above this, there will be no ice at the poles, no ice caps. I think if we go back in time, the best times to compare to our future is the late Eocene and Miocene ice house. So if we make maps of the world at that time, fortunately, that wasn't too long ago, 15 million years and 30 million years. The continents were about in the same positions. So this gives us sort of a reasonable estimate of how sea level will change. We can see that the areas near the continental margins will be flooded. Florida will be entirely underwater. Much of interior of Eurasia around the Caspian and Black Sea will be more flooded. And we may have a little bit of an ice cap, but probably we'll lose all of the northern ice cap and most of the southern ice cap. So that's temperature, and that's temperature based on geological evidence and also oxygen isotope measurements. However, when most people talk about temperature change, they talk about CO2. So we didn't use any CO2 in our model. I just wanted to emphasize that. But we can now compare what we know about CO2 with the temperatures we predicted. So what I'd like to briefly talk about is how atmospheric CO2 has changed during the last 540 million years. And an important question is, how well does it correlate with temperature change? This diagram summarizes it, and I'll be looking at this in more detail. But I should say the CO2 data comes from a different set of proxy information, paleosols, phytoplankton, leaf shape, and stomatal indices. All of these have given us an estimate of the level of CO2 in the atmosphere. And again, you can see there's quite a bit of noise. So what I did was basically take this data, did the same thing that I did with the temperature data, and calculate the average for each million years. So the black dots represent the predicted CO2 level given along this axis for the proxy data for each million year bin. And then I used a very simple curve fitting technique to fit most of the data points. you can see this red curve is the previous estimate. Now, the previous estimate goes right through the data points, as one expect. Sometimes there's problems because there are often intervals where there's no data, or the data are very divergent. In other words, the CO2 levels change radically over time intervals. So if you're calculating the average, the red line has to pass between the black and the red and the white open circles. What I did is I took a little bit different approach. I said I will fit the data when we have enough data and when there's no contradictions with the geological record, but then I will fill in the gaps with a new estimate based on the temperature curve. So for instance, for the Triassic, if we just use the data itself, we don't know what the value is because it changes rapidly. So basically, I reject all these CO2 values, which suggest very cool temperatures, because we know geologically and from the isotope data, the temperatures were very warm. So I redrew the Triassic portion of the curve. Similarly, where there's very few data, I tried to make sure that the peaks in the CO2 data match the peaks in the temperature data. So these vertical lines represent curves that are estimates based on the hothouse and icehouse temperature intervals. Probably one of the most interesting changes for the Cenomanian Turonian maximum, which we know was a high period. I rejected all these data and drew the curve in a way that was proportional to what we saw in the temperature curve. So this is a new temperature curve based mostly on proxy data, but modified to represent what we've learned geologically and geochemically from about temperature from the geological and isotopic measurements. Again, it's not circular because no CO2 data was used for this curve. And essentially, we're improving the CO2 data with our knowledge of temperature back through time. So if we use this information, we can put together a CO2 curve. These again are the IPC estimates, and the carbon budget model that I put together predicts that we'll end up with CO2 levels about 770 and then level off. So what will that mean in terms of temperature? And this is the final slide of my presentation. Talking about global temperatures, we talk about numbers like 14 or 15 degrees average temperature, which correlates with about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. It's not very meaningful. The numbers don't mean much to people. So what I tried to do was identify cities that and listed their average temperature, their low temperature, and their high temperature during the year. So I live in Chicago. So the average temperature in Chicago is about 11 degrees centigrade, 52 degrees Fahrenheit. And that turns out to be what the average temperature was during the last ice age. And it comes no surprise to me as a Chicago native that we live in an ice age climate if you live in Chicago. If we look at the average temperature, the modern average temperature, 15 degrees, that corresponds with the average temperature of Nashville, Tennessee, which is about 400 miles south of Chicago. The minimum temperature in Chicago is about 8 degrees. Again, that corresponds to the ice age, and the range goes from about 8 to about 15. Anyway, so these are Los Angeles, which everyone thinks has a reasonably good temperature, is a nice place to live, has an average temperature about 19. And that's about where the carbon budget that I predicted shows that we're headed. So in the future, if you live in the future Los Angeles, that'll be representative of the average temperature over the entire Earth. Now, that's a little bit misleading, of course, because there will still be cooler areas, but more importantly, there'll be areas that are much warmer. So not everybody will benefit from a nice climate like in Los Angeles. Now, if we go to the other extreme, Abu Dhabi has an average temperature of about 29 degrees centigrade or 84 Fahrenheit. So that represents an extreme hothouse, very, very hot place to live. Miami is a hothouse, but I think most people again would agree that Miami is not horrible temperature. In fact, it very rarely gets above 100 during the summer because it's surrounded by water. The average temperature is about 77 degrees. It gets up to about 27 or 81 in the summer and cools down to about 22 or 72 Fahrenheit in the winter. As you can see, I put Mexico City on this chart also. So basically, Mexico City, like Miami, the average temperature represents what the average temperature of the Earth was like during a typical hothouse interval, or a sort of a warmer hothouse interval. So that's just a different way to try to appreciate how the Earth's temperature is changing. We are going from a Nashville type climate to a Los Angeles type climate. And again, this is a gross simplification. So that pretty much covers everything I wanted to say. Again, most of this is published, both as the abstract for AGU and in the paper that we published in the Earth Science Reviews. And Professor Urrutia Ukugauchi has copies of these PDFs. And I will be providing a PDF of the slides for my lecture if anyone wants to take time to have a closer look or to get back to me with questions. So I think I'll stop here and thank you for your time and attention, and be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Well, thanks very much, Chris. And it's a really interesting presentation. And we have comments and questions. Many of them congratulating you for your research, and also comments about the talk, a very, very interesting talk. And let me see if I can well, there are several mentioning that it's interesting to see the long-term variation of the climate with the cold and the hot climates, and the students ask if the planet has been mostly warm during the Fanerozoic, or
Okay.
how is the long what controls the long trends in the climate? If it's,
Okay, yeah, no, those are two good questions. Let me share my screen again. So as you can see from, we go to this diagram. This is, again, the summary diagram. You can see that most of the time the Earth has been in a hothouse. In other words, there's been no polar ice caps. And this represents about 70% of the time. And the remaining 30%, the Earth has been in an ice house. So the question is, why has the Earth tended to be warmer in the past? And there's a slide I didn't include that you can use that can answer that question. It's a little bit complicated, but can you see this okay?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so the question is, how does the Earth move from ice house to hothouse? And sort of the trivial answer is that we change the level of CO2 or we change the albedo of the Earth, how much energy is reflected. So basically, the Earth system receives energy from the sun. If the sun gets brighter or cooler, that affects the Earth. And we know there's been a long-term increase in the brightness of the sun. So the Earth has tended to warm up as a result of that. Then we have to figure in how much of that energy is reflected back into space. And the reflection of energy back into space is called the albedo, or basically the whiteness of the Earth, the reflectivity of the Earth. And if we increase the albedo, we make the Earth cooler. So one way we can increase the albedo is we can create more deserts. Deserts are brighter than forests or the ocean. And so that is one possible way to do that. The other way to increase the albedo is to increase the amount of land, because land in general is brighter than the oceans. We create more land by dropping sea level, and the seas retreat, exposing the land. We drop sea level because if continents collide, then the land area goes up, emerges from the sea. Also, when we collide continents, we squeeze the continents together, creating more ocean basin. If the ocean basins are bigger, the water falls into the ocean basins and sea level falls. So we're beginning to see the reason why temperature changes is driven primarily by plate tectonics and by paleogeographic changes that are the result of plate tectonics. So if we go to the icehouse system for a second, if we rift continents, we have more seafloor spreading. More seafloor spreading means the ocean basins basically are filled by the mid-ocean ridges. The mid-ocean ridges displace water onto the continents. Sea level rises. We have shallow seas. Shallow seas decrease the albedo, which means they absorb energy. And basically that makes the Earth warmer. So that is one direct result of plate tectonics. If we had ice at the time, say sea level rises during the last parts of an ice house, when it gets warmer, basically we melt the ice. If we melt the ice is very reflective, we decrease the albedo, so we make it warmer. So we have a very important positive feedback loop called polar amplification, which results in warming. As we warm the Earth, we melt the ice, decrease the albedo, and that results in more melting, less ice, etc. If we have less ice, that means the ice turns into water. The water has to go back into the ocean basins. So we raise sea level. If we raise sea level, we have more shallow sea. We decrease the albedo, we make it warmer. We have less ice, we raise sea level. So you see another positive feedback mechanism. So as sea level rises, also we have a warming event. If we go back to the cause again, rift continents, establish mid-ocean ridges, more seafloor spreading. More seafloor spreading means more volcanic eruptions. More volcanic eruptions means more CO2. More CO2 basically melts the tundra. And as we melt the tundra, we get more CO2. And as we get more CO2, the Earth gets warmer. CO2 is a greenhouse gas. So we have another positive feedback here. More CO2 makes the Earth warmer. We melt the tundra, which releases, as it decomposes, methane and CO2 into the atmosphere, and that makes it warmer. So from my point of view, one interesting thing about these diagrams is how plate tectonics controls or modulates the temperature. It's essentially, the Earth has many thermostats, and plate tectonics adjusts many of these thermostats. The other thing is, as the Earth either warms or cools, there are natural positive feedback cycles that amplify any changes that are taking place. So one of them, raising sea level, melting ice affect the albedo. Melting tundra creates more greenhouse gases. If we go on this side, we see another positive feedback here. If we warm the oceans, we melt the clathrates, which are methane deposits sequestered in crystals in the deep ocean. So that releases methane, which becomes CO2, which makes it warmer, which means we warm the oceans, and this arrow should be going the other way, and release more clathrates, etc. Now, some of the trajectories are unidirectional. In other words, if we have a lip or large igneous eruption, that's essentially a huge volcanic eruption that creates more CO2, then that CO2 warms the planet. And that's something we've seen already. When we looked at the correlation of lip events and temperature, there seemed to be a number of temperature excursions that correlate with large igneous eruptions. Also, when continents move, they move into different climatic belts. We saw there were 5 Keppen belts. Each Keppen belt has a different effect on climate. It both reflects the climate, but affects the climate. For instance, deserts, when the continents move into the desert area, there's less weathering. Less weathering means there's less calcium released into the rivers and oceans. We make less carbonate. If we make less carbonate, then we don't store as much CO2 in the oceans. If we don't put the CO2 in the oceans, it stays in the atmosphere. So having large desert belts basically amplifies the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. In contrast, land in the wet belts, either the equatorial wet belt or the temperate wet belt, has the opposite effect. If we have land in the wet belts, we have more weathering. Weathering provides calcium, we can make more carbonate, we can decrease CO2. And one would argue that as we make the Earth cooler, basically we reduce the weathering, so there might be a negative feedback cycle embedded in this somewhere. So I won't go into all the details of this, but you can sort of see this was an attempt to try to link the causes of climate change to plate tectonic events and specific geological events, as well as the changing geography of the planet. So it's a very complex system, but I think eventually we'll be able to sort out all these Earth system variables and build a model that will allow us to predict both global temperature and CO2 purely on first principles of plate motion and changing paleogeography.
Well, thanks very much, Chris. It's interesting to see the number of factors involved in the climate system, and this explanation addresses well, many of the questions that we have, and including some about the longer-term changes and the short-term changes in the climate. So it's
Right.
It's very good to see.
Yeah, there are climate and temperature in particular changes at different timescales, as you were alluding. And
Yes.
if I go to this diagram again, if I can get it to work. So I would say that there are let me go back to the beginning. Okay, so there's a very long period change on the order of 150 million years, which I think is due to the gradual motions of the continents across latitudinal belts. There are intervals of 10 million years. I think these can be related to things like large igneous province eruptions or continental weathering. And then there are much shorter intervals, shorter periods, which are clearly driven by things like rapid gas release, either again volcanic eruptions or maybe clath rates. And then there's the 100,000-year events, which appear to be modulated by Milankovitch cycles. But these even though Milankovitch cycles are occurring all the time, the Earth has to be in a very sensitive position where these very slight changes can affect climate. And that seems to happen when the Earth is very cold. So when the Earth is very cold, a little bit of warming creates positive feedbacks that warm it more. So the positive feedbacks are more effective during times when the Earth is very cold. If the Earth is very warm, the Milankovitch cycles are not as prominent. We probably see them in terms of sedimentation because they probably affect rainfall and precipitation. So the Milankovitch periods may be a little bit wetter, a little bit drier, but they don't affect climate as much as they do during cool intervals. And then, of course, the impact events, very short-lived, that create major deviations from average climate, but only on the order of less than 1 million years, probably tens of thousands of years before the system corrects itself and gets back to whatever the usual equilibrium state would be.
And this is a very interesting graph, and opens a lot of questions, actually. We have also some questions about the snowball Earth, and
Sure.
also well, one of them is if it's possible to have to be back again in a snowball Earth or not, and also questions about how or why the snowball Earth ended,
Right.
because well, it's not very clear the comment, but it says that a snowball Earth produces a very high albedo, and how the Earth warmed again.
Right. Well, first of all, let me address the snowball Earth is one of the most remarkable climatic events in Earth history. You can see just by comparing the pole to equator gradient for the snowball Earth with what we experienced during the last 540 million years. It's just completely out of the ballpark. It's extremely cold. And part of that has to do with the ice albedo effect. Probably the most important on this, one of the two most important temperatures on this graph is the -10 degrees. The surface temperature has to get to -10 degrees for permanent ice and snow to form. So if we want a snowball Earth that extends all the way down to the equator, the temperature at the equator has to be -10. We would expect the temperature gradient to also increase as it does from hothouse to icehouse, so that it becomes even colder as we go back, as we go up to high latitude. So by the time we get to the poles, it's somewhere around -90 degrees. Now, once we've achieved this, it's a very stable situation, because what we've done at -90 degrees, above, say, 60 degrees latitude, that means that we're below the freezing temperature of carbon dioxide. So any carbon dioxide that escapes into the atmosphere is immediately frozen and can't be used as a greenhouse gas to warm the Earth. The other CO2, of course, is trapped beneath the ice. So it basically has no greenhouse effect if it's dissolved in the ocean. Now, how do we get to -10? Well, the issue is that as the Earth cools into an icehouse, the latitude of the ice cap begins to move south, move towards the equator. So, for instance, today's world, we're in an icehouse. The average latitude of the north and south polar ice cap is about 68 degrees. As the Earth cools, even just a little bit, the ice cap moves further and further south. When it gets to 30 degrees, if the ice cap gets to 30 degrees, which isn't too far away from where it was during the last glacial maximum, it got down to the Ohio River Valley, which is about 35 to 40 degrees. If it gets to 30 degrees, suddenly we're reflecting more energy away from the Earth than we're receiving. So 30 degrees is sort of the boundary. Above 30 degrees, we can still have open ocean and water south of 30. But if the ice cap gets below 30, we begin to reflect more and more energy. So the ice cap grows even faster. And so so that in a matter of a few 100,000 years, the ice cap just completely grows, and the northern hemisphere ice cap and the southern hemisphere ice cap meet at the equator. And when that happens, obviously the Earth is locked in a permanent ice age, because 85% or more of the sun's energies be reflecting back into space. So there's nothing to warm the Earth. In fact, I did a quick back in the envelope calculation, and the temperatures that the Earth exhibited during snowball Earth was about the same as the current temperatures on Mars, which we know is very cold. Now, Mars is cold for two different reasons. There's no atmosphere, but as we know, Mars has a CO2 ice cap. Mars does get a little bit warmer in the summer because there is no ice and the ground can warm. But anyway, roughly speaking, Mars receives only 20% of the sunlight that the Earth receives. And that was the same situation during snowball Earth. The Earth was receiving only 20% of the amount of energy that it's receiving now. So how did it get out? How did it warm? This is just a temperature graph. Again, this is 800 million years ago, the Cambrian. These are the three major mega ice ages. The largest was the Sturtian, which lasted for a long time. It lasted for 50 million years. So we see once the Earth gets locked in a snowball, it's hard for the Earth to get out of it. These dashed lines represent what I'm sort of figuratively calling escape events. In other words, say there's a crack in the ice somewhere due to a large earthquake or volcano. The CO2 that's dissolved in the ocean can escape in the atmosphere and begin to warm the Earth, which, if it continued, would then melt the ice and snow and eliminate the feedback. However, of course, when the temperatures at the equator are -10 degrees and the average temperature is -42 degrees, much of that CO2 immediately freezes and isn't a greenhouse gas. So these are what I call annealed escape attempts, where some CO2 escapes, the Earth gets warmer, but then the ice heals, so to speak, and we just have scar tissue. So basically, the way we get out of a snowball Earth is so much CO2 builds up in the oceans that it basically forces its way to the surface. And once it gets an avenue to escape, there's so much released that the Earth is able to rapidly undo the ice albedo effect. And you can see the idea here is we're at -42. And if one of these major events occurs, we rapidly, over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, increase the temperature and get out of the ice age. But again, this is just hypothetical. To me, it is so amazing what the Earth would have looked like at this time, or what was going on at this time. So un-Earth-like in many respects. In addition to what's happening in the oceans on the surface, we lose the Hadley cell circulation. Now, Hadley cell is where the equator is warmer, the air rises and sinks in the subtropics. In this case, the equator isn't warmer, or just marginally warmer. And the difference in temperature between the surface of the Earth and the troposphere is negligible. So there's no temperature differential for warm air to rise. There's no gradient. So without the Hadley cells, it's a totally different world. The gradient is much steeper. Anyway, so that's some of my thoughts on the snowball Earth. Basically, we get there by, this is the boundary right here. So when we get to this point, if the global ice front reaches 30 degrees, we have a rapid ice albedo effect, which just rapidly cools the Earth down. And the ice front rapidly advances from 30 degrees north and south to the equator. Now, 30 degrees north and south still represents half the area of the Earth. So we go from half the Earth covered with ice to an Earth covered completely in ice, a Earth that's so cold that dry ice collects at the poles and eliminates any vestiges of Hadley cell circulation. Instead, what we get, we're all familiar with these polar vortices. You probably aren't affected by them too much in Mexico, but as we weaken the Earth's jet stream, we have these polar vortices which emanate from the poles and travel to very low latitudes. That's what the Earth's atmospheric circulation would be like, these super polar vortices constantly moving across the surface of the Earth from the poles to the equator. So.
Yeah, the snowball Earth is, well, I agree that it's a very interesting time, and it's the largest climate change we have in this record. It's really interesting, and also interesting that well, the rise of the multicellular organisms started after the
the rise of the Metazoan. Basically, it's amazing that life survived this event. There must have been areas near volcanoes, areas that were a little bit warmer. The oceans, of course, were colder. The bottom of the oceans were -12. Maybe things went into sort of a very strange hibernation, deep sleep, where metabolism was slowed down tremendously. But life obviously survived the snowball Earth. It didn't do so well at the other extreme. During the extreme hothouse, 99% of everything on the Earth was wiped out. So life seems to have an easier time surviving cold temperatures than warm temperatures. That makes sense, because above 40 degrees, what makes 40 degrees so deadly is that's when proteins begin to break down, they begin to denature. So it's something you can't adapt to. If the chemistry of your body, if you're made of proteins and proteins fall apart at 40 degrees, 40 degrees is a lethal limit. It's, the old, you can fry an egg on the sidewalk if the temperature gets warm enough during the summer. It's the same thing, basically. And only selected environments can make it through these extreme temperatures.
Yes. Well, this is why climate is so linked to the life in the planet. We have questions about how is the climate when we have supercontinents and a single ocean. How does the supercontinent affect the climate?
Yeah, there is an effect. Obviously, we had supercontinents about every 200 million years. The last large supercontinent was from the end of the Carboniferous to the beginning of the Jurassic. So this interval. So one could argue that this increase in temperature in part occurred during a supercontinent, but this was a special event. In general, supercontinents should make things cool. If we go back to our other diagram that I had up a second ago, if I could find it. When we make supercontinents, we basically are colliding continents, we're illuminating oceans, and that should make the Earth cooler. So we formed Pangaea during the Carboniferous. We began to put together during the late Carboniferous. And indeed, that has been suggested as one of the reasons for the Permo-Carboniferous Ice Age. So this ice age may have been caused by the creation of Pangaea at this time. But obviously, things warmed up after that. So it wasn't enough to keep it cool. It's a very complex story. We built Pangaea. We also evolved plants at this time in the late Devonian, in the early Devonian, late Devonian. By the late Devonian, we have our first coal swamps. So this was also a time of massive coal deposits. The CO2 is pulled out of the atmosphere, and that makes the Earth cooler. And we can have coal swamps because we had a lot of land, and so there was a lot of fringing area around the land areas where the coals could accumulate. It's almost clear that during the late Jurassic and early Cretaceous, as we break apart the continents, the temperature warms. So this system, the hothouse system, comes into effect during the rifting of continents, during the rifting of Pangaeas. So if we wanted to make a generality, colliding continents cools the Earth, and rifting continents warms the Earth. But a lot of other things can happen during those time intervals.
Okay. Yes. Well, we have questions about the latitudinal pattern, with the cupping belts. One is if these cupping belts have been a characteristic of the climate during the Fanerozoic, which I think is already, well, you cover showing the cupping belts in one of the, yes, in this diagram. And these transitions between ice cap periods and no ice cap periods, if this affects the global climate, or the changes are mostly in the equatorial region?
Yeah, actually, when we move from ice house to hot house, the belts near the equator don't change hardly at all, and that's because they're created by Hadley cell circulation, and the Hadley cell circulation exists at both times. In other words, the wet belt is where the air rises and condenses, and you get high precipitation. The air masses continue to rise and cool, and as they cool, they sink, but there's no longer any water in the air mass. So as the air mass hits the surface, it absorbs water, and basically you have a drying condition. And we have both of these happening both at times when the continents are coming together and rifting apart. All the changes that we see in the Keppen belts occur at higher latitudes. Again, the most obvious is that during ice house times, we have polar ice caps, which we don't have during warm times. And all we get maybe is some cool deposits like glendonites, and indicating that some of the water is cooler, maybe during the winter or in the periphery of glacials. But we have another interesting pattern during hothouse times. We have a climatic belt that we don't have during hot icehouse times. You can see this labeled boreotropical. Okay, when we think of the tropics, we think of the belt around 20 degrees or so, basically where Mexico is nowadays. Mexico is in the tropics. There's the arid belt, and on either side of the tropics, and then we get into the warm temperate. The boreotropical is interesting in that we have rock deposits at relatively high latitudes, 40 and 50 degrees, that are identical to the ones we see at the equator. In particular, looking at bauxites and laterites. We have bauxites and laterites at the equator, not only because it's warm, but because it's warm and wet. It means we have a lot of chemical weathering, and we can reduce the minerals containing alumina into aluminum oxide. We usually don't get that in the colder times because it's not wet enough or warm enough. But during hothouse times, we have a belt which is wet and warm, and warm enough and wet enough to produce bauxite deposits, which we don't see during cooler time periods. So we lose the polar ice caps, but we gain another belt that tells us about something about the climatic conditions.
No, okay, yes. Well, I think we have more or less covered all of the questions. Thanks very much for sending questions and comments. And we have several congratulating you for the studies and asking if we can share a copy of the paper. Yeah, we will put the copies of the papers at your disposal, and we will be very happy to send copies to all of you. And yes, I think we already covered
Great. Well, I think we covered a lot of material. And
yes,
if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to share my email. It's on, I think it's on the first slide, cscotese@gmail.com. And if anyone is doing research that you think might be of interest to help solving more of these problems or providing data sets that could help us understand the climate history of the Earth, I'd be certainly interested in hearing about your research and the work you're doing. And again, thank you for the chance to present my research to your group. And I appreciate the time and the interest.
No, thanks to you, Chris. It's really fascinating to see how the climate during the Fanerozoic and and also the body interrelation of so many factors and mechanisms involved. And there are some comments about this. The correlation you showed about the geological events and the temperature, including these large igneous provinces and the effect of the Siberian traps and all the and also, well, to me, the correlation with the asteroid impacts, including Chicxulub, it's interesting how this is recorded in the temperature changes and the climate effects. Thanks very much, Chris. It's really interesting. I will send you some of the questions we have more specific about the technical aspects.
Okay.
But thanks to all for joining us, and thanks, Chris. And we have also congratulations and regards from different places, including the UNAM offices in the US, in San Antonio, and also we have an office in Chicago, and
okay.
We take the opportunity to say hello to all of the UNAM offices in the USA and also in the other parts. And thanks very much to the high school system at the university. Thanks for always joining us, and also for sending questions and comments.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Chris. And Dionisio, if you want to say something, Dionisio, si quiere comentar
sí,
para cerrar.
Pues muchísimas gracias a todos, muchísimas gracias, Jaime, por la conducción de esta muy, muy interesante presentación que nos ha hecho el profesor Scotese. Y pues nuevamente nos felicitamos de que tengamos esta oportunidad de conversar pues con verdaderos científicos que cada martes nos actualizan, porque siempre se trata de investigaciones en curso, los avances que están haciendo en sus investigaciones. Como decía al principio, la pandemia trajo consigo la necesidad de que nosotros respetáramos más al planeta, y qué mejor manera de respetarlo que conocerlo. De manera que una plática como la de hoy, pues nos hace ver que vivimos en un planeta vivo, en un planeta que es mucho más antiguo que la presencia del hombre en la Tierra, un planeta que está permanentemente en evolución y sobre el cual nos preguntamos, pues, ¿cuándo volverán estas circunstancias que generan mayor calor o mayor frío en el comportamiento de su temperatura? Sí parece ya demostrado que el hombre incide en el comportamiento de la temperatura del planeta y incide desafortunadamente para mal. De manera que lo que aquí se recuerda de los compromisos de París y las probables implicaciones que pudieran tener en el planeta el incumplimiento de estas metas, pues nos refuerza la conciencia de que tenemos que tratar con respeto al planeta y que tenemos que asumir con responsabilidad y con seriedad los compromisos que derivan para cuidarlo. Una práctica como la que hoy nos ha hecho el profesor Scotese nos recuerda esta obligación y nos motiva a seguir adelante en la defensa del planeta. Para nosotros es muy grato que estas pláticas pues abran la oportunidad de que tengamos un intercambio con los jóvenes estudiantes y las preguntas que aquí se han hecho acreditan el interés de investigadores y de alumnos de conocer cómo está evolucionando nuestro planeta. Y no mencionó Jaime, pero seguramente tenemos presencias de muchas partes del mundo que siguen también y gracias a las oportunidades que hoy derivan de la presentación a través de las redes y de la integración de este consorcio, en donde son muchos los interesados en seguir con interés las pláticas que se dan cada martes. De manera que para nosotros, pues ese es un motivo de particular satisfacción y es un motivo también que nos sirve como acicate para seguir adelante. Estamos celebrando, como todos ustedes saben, los 30 años de Fundación UNAM, y qué mejor para nosotros que celebrarlos con eventos de esta naturaleza, porque nosotros creemos que lo que debemos de hacer como fundación es acompañar los objetivos de la UNAM. Y los objetivos de la UNAM, como todos saben, es el impulso a la docencia y el impulso a la investigación científica, que aquí se acredita, y el objetivo de la difusión de la cultura, que va inmerso en presentaciones como la que hoy hacemos. Muchas gracias a todos. Gracias al profesor Scotese por esta presentación. Gracias a Jaime. Gracias al consorcio que nos mantiene tan vinculados a la evolución que se está haciendo en el estudio de la ciencia, en el estudio del planeta, y que, como ya mencionaba Jaime al principio, son más de 100 presentaciones las que venimos realizando hasta ahora y que se ha constituido ya en un imperativo sincronizarnos a las 12 cada martes y a las 3 de la tarde cada jueves para ver estos documentales por TV UNAM, que, como mencionábamos, llamó la atención de la UNESCO para hacer un mecanismo adecuado de divulgación de la ciencia y para invitarnos a formar parte de su comité asesor. Muchas gracias a todos y muy buenas tardes.
Thank you.